Well, I welcome you to another edition of the Imperial Church as we continue our discussion of the history of Christianity. It's good to be with you tonight. Thank you for joining by Zoom or here in person. And we're going to continue with our examination of this time. Now, the Imperial Church is actually a fairly short period of time in the history of the church. Remember, I said that it really only encompasses about 100 years, from about the conversion of Constantine in roughly 311 to Augustine, roughly early part of the 5th century. So you're really just looking at about a 100-year period of time. So you put that into perspective, the early church was from 30 to 311, so it's almost 300 years, 3 times as long. But nonetheless, this is a very important time in the history of the Christian church. And part of the reason that we're going to focus on it as we are is because of the fact that it, in many ways, as you probably noticed over the last couple times, it mirrors a little of the church in America, or I would say the church in the West, where you have this sense where Christianity is sort of accepted as the norm in society, and many people call themselves Christians, have absolutely no idea who Christ is and no idea what faith is, but nonetheless would identify themselves as Christians. And so this period of time is very similar to our time. So applications coming out of that early period of time are going to find themselves applying to us in this age as well. Now, tonight I'm going to talk to you about what I call the Post-Nicene Imperial Church. Nicea, you remember, was the ecumenical council called in 325 to attempt to address the issues related to the nature of God, more specifically the nature of the Son of God in terms of his substance related to the Father, a subject we will continue tonight. And it's important for us to remember that the Imperial Church is now in a time in which it has become the de facto standard religion of the empire. Now, again, as I've said before, Christianity was never declared to be the official religion of the empire. It just became that. We call it the de facto religion of the empire because by virtue of the emperor himself being converted, Christianity became a part of the life of the empire. It became a part of all aspects of the communal life of the empire. And there were a number of significant theological issues that arose during this period of time. In fact, I think probably the most significant one of them, which was dealt with at Nicea, arose during this time. And as I mentioned, the ecumenical council called at Nicea attempted to formalize an orthodox position on this and establishing, you remember, the creed, which was designed to say this is what Orthodox Christianity believes in regards to the Trinity. If I put the article on it, I got it. Okay. But the church was not able to stop the advance of this heterodox view known as Arianism even after Nicea. Nicea was supposedly going to be the establishment of an official sense on this, but it was not able to do so. And so that's what I'm talking about when I get into this post-Nicene world that we're going to be talking about tonight. To do this, I want to tonight talk about 3 things. Okay? I want to talk first about an emperor by the name of Julian. And then I want to talk about a bishop by the name of Athanasius. And then I want to talk about a council by the name of Constantinople. All right, those 3 things are all intimately connected together, and you'll see how they work together in this post-Nicene world. Constantine the First, as it turns out, died in 337. He was only about 30 or 31 years old. Not very old, but then again, at the time, life expectancy was much less than it is today, so 30 and 31 years old would not be unusual in those days. He was baptized, I think I mentioned this in the past, on his deathbed by Eusebius of Nicomedia, the one who had taken the Arian position at the Council of Nicea, who also was the great opposer of the Orthodox position, as we'll see it continuing on here. Constantine being baptized on his deathbed was a common practice. There was this belief that baptism was designed to wash away your sin, so you wanted to wait till as long as possible before you got baptized so that as few of your sins went with you beyond this life. So if you could wait till your deathbed, as Constantine did, that was the proper approach. Now, again, don't forget, we're talking about a very early time in the history, theologically, of the church, and many of these issues have not been fleshed out yet. And so a lot of these early ideas seem to us rather quaint and even foolish, but nonetheless, that's what they were in those days. After the death of Constantine, a great purge took place. The army, which was loyal to Constantine, killed most of Constantine's relatives. They did so out of utter loyalty to him. They believed, out of their loyalty to him, that his sons were rightfully the heirs of the throne. And so they purged all of the rest of the family in order to get rid of any pretenders to the throne. That's not an uncommon practice. Sounds barbaric to us, but that was not uncommon in the Roman world at the time. They were not attempting to establish a new dynasty. They simply wanted to assure that Constantine's 3 sons inherited the throne. These 3 sons were of the following. The eldest of the 3 was Constantine II, named after his father. He was granted rule over what was then known as Gaul, which is Western Europe, Great Britain, Spain, and Morocco. So imagine the western side of Europe was given to him for his control. The youngest son was a man by the name of Constantius. I have so much trouble with that name. Constantius II. He was named after his grandfather, Constantine's father, whose name was Constantius. So he would be Constantius II. He was given rule over the entirety of the East. So you go all of Asia Minor and the Middle East, Syria to the east, and then pushing towards the borders of Persia to the east. That was his territory to rule over, which of course included Constantinople, which was at this time, you remember, the de facto capital of the Roman Empire. Constantine, you remember, had made it that. The middle son was a man by the name of Constans, C-O-N-S-T-A-N-S, or Constans would be another way to say it. He ruled over an area in between those two. So if you take Western Europe and separate it from the east, you have a slice in the middle, which includes Italy, probably Greece, Northern Africa. That would be his territory centered in the middle. Now, Constantine II, the eldest son, was pro-Nicene. He rejected the Arian philosophy and embraced the Nicene theology. But Constantius, I'm going to have to say that name a lot tonight, so Constantius, ruling over the East, became pro-Arian because that's where Arianism was focused and centered, was in the East, particularly in Constantinople. Now, although all of Constantine's relatives were killed, with the exception of his 3 sons, there were 2 other young men who were spared in the midst of this purge. One of them was a man by the name of Gallus. He was young at the time, probably, I would guess, 10 years old. I'm not exactly sure how old he is, but I'm just going to guess somewhere around 10 years old. And he had a half-brother by the name of Julian, who was 6 at the time. Rumor has it that these 2 young boys were spared by Constantius in the east because they were simply too young to be any threat to the family, and so they were allowed to live. The massacre itself of the entirety of Constantine's relatives was in fact blamed on Constantius in the east. Okay? He was blamed for it because, of course, he was in Constantinople at the time. And since the family's in Constantinople, most of the relatives are nearby, he's blamed for it by the masses for the fact that this purge took place. Now, there's much intrigue between what I just said and what I'm about to say. There's a lot that happens here. I'm going to fast forward to this. Constantius eventually becomes emperor over all of the empire. The three sons have their separate spaces, but through a series of intrigues and conflicts between them, they never really liked each other and they fought with each other over time. Eventually, Constantius took control of the entirety of the empire, but he had no sons. And this was a problem for him because he would obviously want to pass on his emperorship to a son. And so he calls for his cousin, Gallus, to come and to be his Caesar. Now you remember that dual authority thing that was set up earlier in the empire, where the main emperor would call himself the Augustus, and the second would call himself the Caesar. Okay, so Constantius calls for Gallus to come and become his Caesar, as the Augustus. But this young Gallus was inept, and there is rumor that he even conspired against Constantius during the course of his rulership, and so Constantius had him banished and beheaded. Ended it. So, again, without a son, Constantius decides to call for the other brother of Gallus, Julian, to come and to be his Caesar. And tension rose between them as well. They too struggled with how to maintain this dual emperorship. It doesn't really work, right? And so they struggled, and they even got to the point where they were about to go into battle against each other. They had literally drawn up forces against each other when Constantius dies. This leaves Julian now as the sole emperor of the empire. Constantius, as you know, as I said a moment ago, was a full supporter of Arianism. Being from the East and embracing the Arian philosophy, at the death of Constantine and the rise of Julian to the throne, Jerome, the historian, writes this statement. He says, and I think I quoted this the week before last, "The whole world woke up as from a slumber and discovered itself to be Arian." This doctrine, this philosophy of Arianism, had captured the entirety of the empire. It had started in the East, and it had spread itself into the West. And so at this point, given that Constantius himself was pro-Arian, virtually all of the bishops throughout the empire had signed loyalty and theological statements reflecting an Arian position. And so the whole world wakes up, discovers itself to be Arian. Which moves us into the life of this man, Julian. Julian was hustled away from the family after the purge, saved as he was, but eventually hustled off, and he went to Athens. Eventually found himself in the Greek epicenter, where he studied philosophy, and in the process of doing so, abandoned his early upbringing as a believer. He was, in fact, a Christian when he first started. He had been catechized as a catechumen, even to the point of being baptized into the church at a younger age. But now, in Athens, studying the ancient philosophies of the Greek and Roman pantheon of gods, he became enamored with paganism and abandoned his Christianity. He then became known as Julian the Apostate. That's the moniker that stuck to the man over all these years because he abandoned his initial faith. As I said, after Constantius dies, he rises to the position of the lone emperor over the entirety of Rome, and he despised Christianity. His first act as emperor was to seek revenge against those who had kept him from the throne. Now again, the palace intrigue is not too far away, and so now that the young man has grown up and become the emperor, guess what he's going to do? Wipe out all of those who had kept him from the throne all those years. And he began a process of attempting to restore the lost glory of paganism, particularly of the temple variety, the various kinds of paganisms that existed around the various cultish temples throughout the empire. Remember, I showed you last week a number of the temples that you could see throughout the empire, most of them in ruins now, but temples to the various former emperors and even gods. The temple of Artemis and Trajan, the empire emperor, and Apollos, and so on. All these various temples were the centers of pagan worship. And Julian wanted to restore them to their glory. So he did not pursue a program of persecuting Christians. He did not attempt to rewind the clock back to the pre-Imperial Church days when the church was on the run, because at this point there was simply too much in place surrounding Christianity for him to pull it off. Everybody in the empire was involved in some way in Christianity. The church had grown dramatically in terms of its size, not necessarily in terms of its depth, but in terms of its size. And so he knew that any attempt to persecute Christians would backfire. He knew that it would come back to bite him. So he realized in the face of this world that he was looking at, he needed to do something else. So he tried what one historian calls an end run around Christianity, a different kind of attack in which he tried to diminish Christianity's importance while at the same time raising the importance of the pagan religions which had occupied Rome prior to Constantine being converted. For example, he prohibited Christians from teaching classical literature. All the various Greek, mathematical, and scientific, and philosophical works, he banned from Christians using them to teach. In other words, he withdrew from the Christians a classical education, believing that he could corner them in a world where the only real text that they had was the Bible, which he believed was corrupt. Because he believed, in fact, that the Christians had misunderstood the Hebrew Scriptures and therefore had come up with this form of religion which was considered fake or wrong or in error. And so he thought, if I could just withdraw all of the good works from the Christians and leave them stuck with this faulty book, guess what would happen to the religion? It would fade over time. He believed, he began to publicly ridicule Christians even as Galileans. You followed some Galilean carpenter. That's all you are. You're just a bunch of Galileans. He hoped that that would stick as a way of people feeling the import of that and saying, well, I don't want to be identified as a Galilean, so I'll abandon my Christianity. Julian really hoped that that would be the way in which you could diminish the force of this religion in the empire. He even began a temple rebuilding project where he went to Jerusalem, or he sent a force to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, which you remember had been destroyed under Titus in 70 AD. And the Christians were running around saying, see, the destruction of the temple proves that the sacrificial system is done. The Jews were wrong all along. The Christ has come, and now we only need to look to him. So he figured, if I could rebuild the temple, I can kind of undercut that argument. I can reestablish the temple. The Jews can go back in and do their sacrifices again. And he can say, see, you were wrong. Jesus did not end the sacrificial system. He never actually did complete the project. So Julian believed that he could end Christianity, which he despised. He often consulted with the pagan mystics. He had counselors who had pagan backgrounds, who believed, of course, that they could talk to the pagan gods and get help from the pagan gods on what he was supposed to do. And so Julian decided, and there's much behind this, I'll just summarize, decided that it was time for him to push back the Persians from the eastern borders of the empire. And he took on a very ill-advised campaign to do so. He thought that his pagan advisors actually could tell him what to do. They told him, yeah, you'll be successful if you go up against the Persians. Well, he mustered his forces and attempted to do so and was killed in the process. He was killed by a spear. Rumors have it, floating around the empire at the time, a couple of different rumors floated around the empire at the time. One was that he was actually killed by one of his own men who happened to be a Christian. Another was that he was killed, that he committed suicide in the process. None of those rumors can be validated, though. We don't really know what actually happened. More than likely, he simply got killed by an enemy spear coming at him. But there was another rumor that has circulated about Julian even to this day, and that is that there's this rumor that his last words before dying were, "Thou hast conquered, Galilean." It's been attributed to him. I think it's utterly apocryphal, but it's been attributed to him that even in this moment of dying, he turns and looks to the sky and says, "I was wrong, the Galilean was right." Now, you know, of course, that it's the victors that always get to write the history. So it's more likely that that simply grew up in Christian circles as a way of minimizing Julian, even to say, even at the end, he realized that attempting to embrace the pagan gods and to deny Christianity was wrong. Now, why bring up Julian? He's got a very short reign. His reign, in fact, lasted only 18 months. His desire to return the empire to its pre-Christian state has failed. But here's why I bring him up. It's the first real attempt to undo the effects of Constantine's conversion in the empire. Okay, let me put it to you this way. Nobody in their right mind would expect that after Constantine, there would in fact be a succession of Christian kings. Nobody in their right mind would make that assumption, especially when you consider how a man goes from being a subordinate to being the emperor. As I pointed out, it often happens through intrigue and blood and so forth. Nobody in their right mind is going to believe that the next emperor after Constantine was in fact going to be a Christian. Now, the three sons of Constantine appeared to be Christian, quote unquote, in the sense that they were sympathetic to Christianity. There's no knowledge of whether they actually were believers or not. But Julian becomes really the first real attack against this imperial church that has now come to play as the de facto religion in the empire by virtue of the fact that this emperor Constantine became a believer. Okay, so Julian becomes sort of an anti-Constantine in a sense. Constantine comes, his faith comes, it changes an empire dramatically, and then you have another emperor who comes along and attempts to undo it. Okay, so in the Post-Nicene empire, there's a few things to keep in mind. And these will be consistent, as I said, with us living today in a world in which Christianity is sort of a de facto religion in the West. Number one, there was always an uneasy connection of Christianity to the state, regardless of its growth or its position. There's always an uneasy connection of Christianity to the state. Even in a state where Christianity becomes the de facto religion because the emperor was a believer, things are going to change. The men at the top are going to change. And the result of that is that when the church finds herself in a position of cozying up to the state, the result of that can be disastrous. Secondly, there was always new issues for the church to handle through the time. Despite Nicea, as I said, Arianism continued to grow. Now, Julian himself didn't care about which of these positions won because he could have cared less about the church itself. So he doesn't care whether you're Arian or not. But the church still had to deal with the issue. So even if the state gets out of the business of dealing with the orthodoxy of the church still has to deal with its own orthodoxy. Just try to figure that out. And then third, the orthodoxy often found themselves in the minority. The Orthodox, the true followers of Christ, often find themselves in the minority, holding tenuously to the faith. In a world in which it waxes and wanes in terms of how people embrace the church and the faith, here's what you find. It is often the true believers that are the minority, holding fast to the faith, which is what leads us directly into Athanasius. Athanasius was born somewhere in the Coptic region of the North Nile Delta in Egypt. He was a Coptic Christian. Maybe you've heard of them. They suffered some persecution a few years back at the hands of Muslims. the Coptic Christians in Egypt is still a very strong presence. He was a Coptic from that part of the world. He was short. He had dark features, as anybody from Egypt typically would. And so he was called the Black Dwarf. That was his nickname, if you will. You remember that Athanasius was actually the secretary to the Bishop of Alexandria, a man by the name of Alexander. Remember Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria, who was his bishop, who defended the Orthodox position of Christianity at Nicea. You remember Athanasius was not allowed in because he was not a bishop. Only the bishops could come in and argue. And so Athanasius had to wait outside in the courtyard and listen. Remember, even Arian wasn't a bishop, and so Eusebius of Nicomedia had to go to the council and argue the Arian position, both the men being outside listening in. When his mentor, Alexander, died in 328, Athanasius was appointed to the role. He didn't want it. He didn't want to be the bishop, but he was appointed nonetheless and took it. Now, the reason he didn't want it is to rewind just a bit about Athanasius. Early in his life, Athanasius was introduced to the desert monks. You remember sometime back when we were in the early church, we were talking about the monastic movement and how many would leave the cities and go out into the wilderness, and they would have a more pious and ascetic life in the hope of communing more directly with Christ and holding fast to their faith. Well, Athanasius had been introduced to the monks in the desert in Egypt. Remember, that's where the primary monastic movement took place. And so he became a part of that movement. He maintained that connection all through his life. Therefore, by definition, he was not particularly versed in rhetoric or logic or elegance of style. He wasn't a great preacher of any kind. He was just an ordinary monk, if you will. Not a monk per se, because he didn't become a monk, but he appreciated the monk lifestyle, he appreciated the monastic world, and so he didn't have an elegance to him at all, which I think is exactly the point, as you'll see. But he was particularly close to the people with whom he lived. He had learned this monastic discipline and austerity, which earned him great admiration amongst the monastics. He was well treated amongst those out in the countryside who had given up their urban lifestyle for this desert experience. And in the process, even though he was not overly intelligent, he was intelligent but not overly, he wrote simple treatises centered on the person and work of Jesus Christ, and his works centered on the person and work of Christ as God. Okay, that's important, because he had learned from Alexander, his mentor, that it is important to understand Jesus not just as a man, but to understand Jesus as God. And he had embraced that, and he had begun to write about it. Simple treatises, nonetheless, a couple of which we still have in extant, but nonetheless focusing on that. That sets the stage for where we're going here. Here's a man whose theological focus is on Jesus as the Son of God. All right? Athanasius had a tenacity as a part of his character. Athanasius perceived Arianism to be a threat to the very core of Christianity, and rightly so. We would utterly agree with him at this point. Arianism argues, you remember, that the Son of God is not of the same substance as the Father, that Jesus, by definition, is a created being who has been endowed with whatever level of divinity that you want to argue into it. Very much the religion of the Jehovah's Witnesses today. Jehovah's Witnesses are utterly Arian in their view. That Jesus is not Yahweh, he is simply a divine man, been granted a certain level of divinity, a created being who appeared in the world in the womb of Mary like any other normal child would, was born and then was embraced by God as divine. They would point to Jesus' baptism and say, this is where Jesus was given this divinity. This is my beloved Son, meaning I now appoint him to be my beloved Son. I've watched him for 30 years. He is the man that I want, and so I appoint him to this role. Okay? We would obviously interpret that passage very much differently. But the Arians had this view, and Athanasius perceived it to be a threat to the very core of Christianity itself. The incarnation was denied by the Arians because God didn't come in the flesh, right? Incarnation implies that the Son of God entered into his world, that God himself entered into his world. The Arians said, no, Jesus was just an ordinary man. Thus, Athanasius saw this heresy as a threat to the idea that God himself had come down in human form to conquer evil. Athanasius viewed the coming of the Christ as similar to an emperor coming and visiting a town, and upon those towns certain privileges now come pouring forth. Those privileges do not appear unless it's the emperor himself who shows up. A man coming to claim to be the emperor, or even one of his secretaries or underlings, is not going to be able to bring the same kind of blessings that the emperor himself is going to bring. So Athanasius sees this view of the incarnation in Arianism as a threat to the very core of Christianity itself. And therefore, he was deeply opposed. Obviously, right? The whole world wakes up and finds itself to be Arian, right? Okay, so you understand. You've got one man against the world here. Everybody's an Arian, except for Athanasius. Well, Alexander wasn't either. And there were other pockets, of course, of non-Arians. But you understand that Athanasius, in this view that we have, standing 30,000 feet over him, is that it's one man against the world. And so they began to attack him. And the primary enemy of Athanasius was a man by the name of Eusebius of Nicomedia. The very man who had stood at the Council of Nicea and attempted to defend Arianism. Remember, he had the ear of Constantine. He was a distant relative in some way. I'm not exactly sure how he survived the purge. No history book I've read actually talks about how this man survived, given the fact that he was part of the wider train in Constantine's household. But nonetheless, here he is. First, they accused Athanasius before Constantine of murder. They said that while he's in Alexandria, he killed a man, cut off his head, and used his head in various magical rites in the church. The emperor, Constantine, called for Athanasius to come before him to answer the charge at a place called Tyre. A synod at Tyre was called. Athanasius walks in, hears the charges. He goes out in the hallway. He covers a man standing outside with a cloak. He brings him inside. And he lifts the cloak off of him, and guess who it is? It's the guy he supposedly murdered. Best defense? Best possible defense. They had him banished by Constantine to Trier in the west. Athanasius had in fact gone to Constantinople to try to get a hearing with Constantine. Couldn't. Emperor wouldn't hear him. So what did he do? As I said, he was a tenacious little man. He actually ran out in front of the horses that were drawing Constantine down the road, grabbed the bridle of the horse, and hung on until Constantine granted him an audience. You're not getting out of here until you speak to me. Eusebius told Constantine that Athanasius would actually stop the grain shipments from Egypt to Rome, which caused Constantine to banish him to Trier. He believed Nicomedia, this man from Nicomedia. But he was later restored to Alexandria by the decree of Constantine's sons. In fact, Constantine's sons ordered that all who had been banished under the times of Constantine were to be restored to their positions to sort of mollify the situation. They later drove him out of Alexandria again, this time by force, claiming that he was an illegitimate bishop. This time he was smuggled by ship to Rome. And when he arrived there, he convinced the Roman clergy of the Nicene position. He actually was able to defend Nicea in the West to the church at Rome. And by the way, this is why the church at Rome, the church in the West, didn't struggle as deeply with the Nicene issue as the church in the East did, because Athanasius had gone there sort of before all of this and managed to convince the higher-ups in the Roman church that they should embrace the Nicene position. He was later recalled to Alexandria under the second son of Constantine. Remember, Constance, the one in the middle, who took control of that area. He took over Rome, so he said, okay, go home. And when he came back to Alexandria, he was received joyously as a man of the people because he wasn't one of the upper crust. And so the people saw him as one of their own. They again forced him out of the city under Constantius's emperorship. Okay, so under Constantine twice, under Constans, now under Constantius, he was driven out. You remember I said that Constantius was a committed Arian, and he sought to enforce this theology on the church. The governor of the area around Alexandria, under the orders of Constantius, that Athanasius be expelled from his church, attacked him physically during a communion service. Actually came into the church and attacked him. He managed to escape from the attack, and guess where he went? He went into the desert. He went back amongst the monks, and he stayed there for 5 years, and no one knew where he was during that time. They were looking for him, I guarantee it. They did not find him in that place. When Julian then arose to the throne after the death of Constantius II, Julian, not being interested in this Arian controversy, this Nicene Arian controversy, simply rescinded all the banishments, and Athanasius returned home. But they forced him out of the city again under Julian, and so it went on and on and on. This little man, this little black dwarf, holding fast to Nicene orthodoxy, trying desperately to convince whoever he can, wherever he goes, that the position of the Arians is heretical. He manages some success in some places and not in others. Athanasius fought against the prevailing and ineffective theology of Arianism in this way. Here's how he made his arguments. Arianism, he argued, had sunk into a form of speculation. It had formed into a form of speculative theology, moving from salvation to logic. The Arians, now having won the day, sort of just stepped back and just became more philosophers rather than theologians. This often happens. It's particularly a problem, by the way, in Reformed circles. One of the dangers of Reformed theology is people who get so interested in the nuts and bolts of Reformed theology that they turn into nothing more than philosophers and speculators rather than living that faith out in their lives. One of the dangers that we always have to keep track of in this. And so Arianism could no longer answer the questions of how people are saved. Now, this was always a danger, of course. So it was this that Athanasius seized upon to make a case for Nicene theology. He seized upon this philosophical idea, okay? He said, let me use your own game. All right. The Arians would agree with me that the corruption of humanity is so great that only a new creation can solve the problem. Even the Arians would agree, yes, the corruption, the depravity of humanity is so great that only a new creation can solve this particular issue. This isn't going to be solved by philosophical endeavors or ritualistic religions. It's only going to be solved by a literal recreation. So if that is true, then the work of salvation itself can be nothing less than the work of creation or recreation. If the whole world is so corrupt that everything must be recreated, then the only way that any of us are going to be saved is if there's a new creation that takes place. Thus, only the Creator himself could possibly do such a work. It's a simple logic. If the whole world is depraved, and the only way that that depravity can be resolved is through a new creation, then only the Creator can make that new creation. Now that's unassailably true. Now, have you noticed that would be at the heart of Reformed theology? It'll come back up again at the end of the Dark Ages into the Reformation, right? but it's been abandoned again today. Because the first element of the logic has been lost. The average Christian no longer believes that the world is so depraved that it requires a new creation. Now, they're simply like, well, things are bad and people sin, but God still loves us and He still has a wonderful plan for our life, right? And what they mean by that, of course, is the life you're currently living. Not some new recreated life, but the life. You will notice that Athanasius is driving at the very heart of the Christian faith in this very day and time. He's going back to deal with this very heart of the matter. So Athanasius worked to develop... Is the rest of your page blank there? It is, okay. So Athanasius then worked at this point to develop a compromise. Now, you and I look at compromise as an ugly word, but it's not, all right? In this case, it is a compromise that will be of complete validity, and I want you to think about it as we go through this. He worked to develop a compromise to the Nicene view of the substance of the Son. Okay? Because here's what had happened. There were some who had become Arian because they had a problem. And the problem is that they thought that that the Nicene statement made no distinction between the Father and the Son. The Nicene Creed comes out and says that the Father and the Son are of the same substance. Right? Homoousios, you remember that word, of the same substance. And so there were many who were struggling with how to interpret that. What does that mean? I mean, after all, if the Father and the Son are of the same substance, then that must imply that the bishops of Nicea are saying that the Father and the Son are the same in every sense. And that's a legitimate concern, because in reality, when I say that this is the same substance as that, you're going to assume, well, they're the same thing then. That there's no distinction between them. So Athanasius looks around the world and realizes that there are some who are opposed to the Nicene formula, not because the formula itself is in error, but because they don't know how to interpret it. They don't know what to do with it. Again, I've said this many, many times. Human beings struggle with the idea of Trinitarian theology. And what we are going to inevitably do at times is swing the pendulum one way or the other. To find the balance is really very difficult. On the one hand, we'll say, well, the Father and the Son are completely distinct from each other, not even bearing the same substance. And then we swing the pendulum back the other direction and say, well, they're exactly the same, they're the same everything. But there's a balancing position in between. That's what I mean by this word compromise. There's a balanced position between those two positions, which are utterly wrong in themselves, that when combined become the truth in between. In fact, there were some, now, if you're a Baptist, you're going to understand what I just said. I'm about to say. There were some who actually took the word homoousios and stuck an iota in the middle of it. Iota is a tiny little Greek letter, just an iota in the middle of it to make the word homoousios. Okay, another Greek word, valid Greek word. A little iota in the middle of this word changes the word from of the same substance to of similar substance. Now, from a theological perspective, that's a massive change, but it's just one little tiny letter in the midst of it. I mean, as I said, Baptists will fight over paint colors and walls and split the church over that sort of thing, so you get my point. This is a major distinction between one position and another. You see, what many of these Arians were afraid of, in the end, was that if the Father and the Son were of the same substance, then that implies something called patripassianism. Now, it's a big word, but it's a very simple concept. That when Jesus went to the cross, it was the Father who suffered on the cross. Patra, meaning Father. Passianism, meaning suffer. Patripassianism, meaning the suffering of the Father. There were many who were assuming that what Nicea was arguing is that when the Christ went to the cross, the Father also went to the cross and suffered and died. Suffered. Maybe not died, of course, but suffered on the cross. So Athanasius recognizes why people are struggling with the Nicene Creed, and the problem with people assuming that when you say that the Father and the Son are of the same substance, that must mean that they're utterly equal and even the same in every sense. He realizes that they have come to this error out of their fear of this idea of the Father suffering, and so he begins to deal with it. And he does so by gathering a synod at Alexandria, his home church, in 362. And he makes a declaration in that synod. The synod agrees to this. And the synod is in agreement that Nicene orthodoxy, the statements coming out of the Nicene Creed, could be understood in one of two ways simultaneously. Either of one substance or of three substances. Okay? Now hold it. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, wait a minute. Hold on. Okay? As long as the Father and the Son are seen to have the same substance, as long as you are willing to testify in your orthodoxy that the Father and the Son have the same substance, they are both Yahweh. All of Yahweh is present in both the Father and in the Son. They have the same substance. So as long as you are willing to say that the Father and Son are seen to have the same substance, and as long as the distinctions between the Father and the Son are not lost or downplayed. In other words, even though they are of a singular substance, they are yet distinct from one another, okay? One substance, three substances, okay? One substance, three substances. So the compromise that Athanasius brought out at the Synod of Alexandria was that while the Father and the Son possess the same nature or substance, they are distinct from one another, such that you could say at the time that they would have differing substances. Okay? As long as you're willing to hold both of those things in tension simultaneously, you could be found to be true. Now let me just point out something to you. It will not be for some time until personhood is injected into the discussion. Because you and I will use the word person instead of the word substance here, and that is what will make the distinction for us come clear. But that's not going to come until another council later on. So at this particular time, at the very, in this early part of the church is struggling with how do we understand a Trinitarian God? We know there's only one God. But yet we also know that the Scriptures reveal that this God exists as both Father and Son. Jesus stood there and spoke to his Father. There's a distinction. We believe fully that Jesus is Yahweh in every sense of the word, and yet at the same time he's distinct from the Father. How do we understand that? So at this particular point, the church simply agreed, or the Synod, I should say, of Alexandria, simply agreed to make a clarification of Nicea, and that is, it's perfectly fine for you to say that there is one God with one substance, and there's also one God with three substances, as long as you believe both simultaneously. Now, that is the essence of Trinitarian theology, is it not? We believe that there is one God in one substance, with one nature, one purpose, one decree, one mind, and yet there's three distinct, in this case, our case, persons, which distinguish them, and yet, for some reason, they share fully the same substance of Yahweh. Again, you, if you are Trinitarian, are holding those two ideas, which appear to be in tension with one another, simultaneously, because they are both revealed as true. All right, you with me so far? So Athanasius brings this, quote-unquote, compromise. But he never, unfortunately, lives to see the victory of his compromise in the Christian world. The church around the world eventually accepted this compromise, this position of interpreting Nicea. Even to today, we still see, as I said, we'll see personhood later, but this idea of one God with one substance, yet three distinct substances, was embraced eventually by the whole of the Christian church. But poor Athanasius died before he had an opportunity to see it. In fact, he died in 373, and 8 years later, a second ecumenical council was called to address this issue. It's also known as the First Council of Constantinople, or sometimes referred to as the First Council of the East. The Orthodox Church, the Greek Russian Orthodox Church, embraces this council as the true first ecumenical council that they would look to. All right. As I said, it was gathered in 381, 8 years before, or 8 years after Athanasius died. It was called at the Church of Saint Irene, and I showed you a photo of it last week. This is it. You remember that church? Right outside of Topkapi Palace. This is the Church of Saint Irene. It's hard to see on the camera there, but there it is. Byzantine church. Notice the red brick structure with the large, round, flat-topped arch over the top. Okay, that's your typical Byzantine. This is the church where the Council of Constantinople met in 381. And at the Council of Constantinople, which, by the way, was called by the emperor, his name was Theodosius I. Nice Greek name, right? Theodosius I called this council, and the compromise of Athanasius was ratified. The council, the bishops at that, agreed that Athanasius' compromise, his view of both God as one substance and God as three substances, was to be considered orthodox, and from here it begins to spread out into the world and be embraced. But the First Council of Constantinople added a few things to the creed. Remember, the Nicene Creed basically dealt with the Father and the Son. It is this particular council that added some of the elements at the end of the creed that you may be familiar with. Two of them specifically. Number one, it added supplements against something called pneumatomachianism. That is one big word, but basically it is a statement also expressing that the Father is divine, and the Son is divine, and the Spirit is divine. So at this point, the First Council of Constantinople basically introduces Trinitarian theology. Now, I've been referring to it as Trinitarian all along. From our perspective, it appears that way. But it was really more of a ditrarian view prior to this, where the Father and the Son are considered to be divine. But this council adds language that the Spirit, the third person of the Trinity, is also fully of the same substance as the Father and the Son, and yet exists as a separate substance from the Father and the Son. The language was added to the confession to say that he proceeds from the Father, meaning he's going out from the Father in terms of his purpose and person and so forth. And you remember that will be later amended in the 6th century to include the Son, that he proceeds from both the Father and the Son. Eastern Orthodoxy considers that how do you say that word? Philokwy. The philokwy and the Son to be in error. Remember, they point to this council as their primary council, and so in the East, when you go to an Orthodox church, they will not say that he proceeds from the Father and the Son. For the Spirit, according to them, proceeds only from the Father, sent by the Father. The West assumes it's from both. They added language that he is to be worshipped like the Father and the Son. He's to be treated with divinity, and therefore he is to be respected in worship and treated as a worshipable object, and that he is understood or proclaimed at this point to be the one who spoke by the prophets. That the message of the prophets came through the third person of the Trinity. It wasn't just a message from Yahweh in general, but a personal message coming from the third person of the Trinity. And by the way, for all of us who are Trinitarian, we're always asking that question when we read the Bible. Which of the three persons of the Trinity are involved in this particular aspect of deity? Right? That's why I always say, I believe it was the second person of the Trinity who took the dust from the ground and formed it in the shape of a man and breathed into him, because that's what the Son does. He comes into his world. So if we're going to be good Trinitarians, we're always got to be asking, which person? You ladies studying John should now be convinced of that, because John's gospel is more Trinitarian than any other book in the Bible. right? You should now see it very clearly in that study. But also added to the creed are language involving the church. Now I say church with a capital C, the global universal church. In fact, they are the ones who added the phrase, there is one holy, Catholic, apostolic church. There's only one church in all the world coming from Christ. It is holy, meaning it has been set apart by Christ. It is Catholic, which is a word meaning universal, covers the whole world. And it's apostolic, means that its fundamental definition is defined by the apostles, not by popes. That will come later, but nonetheless, the Nicene Creed puts this in at this particular point. They also write in language that there is only one baptism for the remission of sins. Now, the baptism issue is going to take centuries to get resolved in terms of what it really means for sin and so forth, but they agree there's only one baptism. The idea of running into the baptistry every week to get your sins washed away is now considered heretical by the church. And probably because there were people doing that, I would imagine, at the time. And then finally the language that the church looks for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. That the end of the creed is, and we await the day when Christ will return, and there will be a resurrection from the dead, and then we will live with Christ in glory in the life of the world to come. All right, so those elements are all found in the more modern versions of the Nicene Creed that we have, the ones post First Council of Constantinople. So, I put those three together, okay? So you have Julian, an emperor who comes and attempts to unravel Christianity from the empire, while Christianity is struggling with its own issues. So a man by the name of Athanasius arises to stand against the whole world in order to fight for true orthodoxy, and manages to find the compromise, or to find the clarification, is probably even a better word, that helps us understand true biblical orthodoxy in terms of the Trinity, which is then followed by a council, like the Council of Nicea, but now comes and stamps this to be the reality. So here's the principle I put before you tonight as we come out of this post-Nicene world and this reality. If orthodoxy is worth living under, then it must be worth fighting for. If orthodoxy is worth living under, then it must be worth fighting for. Athanasius believed that the Christian church would be destroyed if Arianism were allowed to continue. And he was right. Because the Christian church would not be what it is today. We would not be worshiping Christ Jesus as the Son of God. We would all have this interpretation of Jesus as simply a man. And Athanasius would be absolutely right. If in fact it takes a creation, a recreation to solve the depravity issues that we have as human beings in our rebellion against God, then it can only be God who has stepped down. The gospel loses its power when the person who's come to doing something is no longer the person that he's claimed to be, as he himself claimed to be. Therefore, our salvation is entirely based on an orthodox view of who Christ is. You understand that, right? Now, we have 2,000 years to deal with this. They did not. But we do. 2,000 years later, there is no excuse for us to abandon any sense of this orthodoxy, because when we do, we not only push aside 2,000 years of church history, but we undercut the very salvation that we claim to hold. So, in other words, if orthodoxy is worth living under, because it's the only thing that can save us, because a proper understanding of what God has revealed is the only thing that could save us, then by definition, it must be something worth fighting for. We must be willing, like Athanasius, to stand against the whole world, if necessary, to defend who Christ is and what he has done. Who he is and what he has done. You understand this? The fight that is coming at us from inside the church, make no mistake about it, the fight that's always come against the faith from inside of the church is first and foremost an attack against the originator of the church itself and his message. Always, always, always. The devil knows he cannot unelect the elect, but here's what he can do. He can destroy the message, because he believes that by destroying the message, he can keep the elect from hearing it. Now, he won't win that game. But that's where he's going to fight. So we are going to have to, in this age, just like Athanasius, we're going to have to be willing to stand up and fight for what is true. Now, that's not going to be an easy fight. And we may stand all by ourselves against the hordes of heretics all around us to hold fast to the gospel. But we must. We must. Because if we don't, the church dies. It would have been true in the beginning part of the 5th century. It certainly is true in this part of the 21st. So I bring this lesson to you to help you think about guys like Julian and Athanasius, opposites of one another. But the one we look to as the hero of the faith is the one who stood against the whole world. Julian stood as the leader of the world to attempt to destroy Christianity, but Athanasius, the short little guy from North Africa, Egypt, stood against the powers that be, banished time after time after time after time, thrown out of his church, banished to the wilderness over and over and over again. But guess what? God vindicated him in the end because he stood fast. So we got to do the same. Very simply, we got to do the same. Yes?
When the council accepted this
Mm-hmm.
compromise,
Yep.
did that bring a lot of the Arians back in?
Yes, it did. Over time, not instantly, of course. But Arianism lost the day at Constantinople. It had lost at Nicea. But the enemies of orthodoxy continued the fight and won the day. But they didn't win the war. So Arianism began to walk away. Now, there's always been pockets of Arianism. Like I said, the Jehovah's Witnesses are still around. They're still teaching the same thing, and I would argue that many Baptists have fallen for this same error over time as well. I've met a few. But ultimately, orthodoxy won. Now, it'll get, as I said, it'll get built upon as we go. There'll be more coming out that will help to establish these things, because there's another round of fight coming, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But that's an excellent question. Any other questions you might have? Yes, go ahead.
Was there then still a separate, is there a pope in the Eastern?
There is not officially a pope in the eastern side, although there is a, what do they call him? What do they call him? There's a name for the leader of the Orthodox Church, but they would never grant him the same status as a pope. They don't believe he's inerrant. They don't believe he speaks ex cathedra like the pope in the West does. All of that develops later. At this particular point, the East and the West are pretty much on common terms. They're separated geographically, and of course they don't live in a global village like we do, and so much of the world on the West has its way of doing things, and the East has its way of doing things, and its problems, and so forth. And so the church is pretty much together, and will stay that way for the first 1,000 years. We don't get to the Great Schism in 1054. But for most of the time, we're going to see a common church with back and forth between both sides of the equation. So even though the church is largely, at this point, more powerful in the East, because that's where Rome, the new Rome is in Constantinople, the church over there, the bishops over there are going to have much more authority. Obviously, a council called at Constantinople, like the one at Nicea, which was nearby, is going to have much more weight. But things will change dramatically as Europe becomes Christianized and the gospel has nowhere to go to the east. So as it pushes towards the west, things will change dramatically in terms of where the power center will become. Patriarch, thank you. The patriarch, yes. They call him a patriarch. Mm-hmm. Yep. What's his name? They got a name? Do they have a name for him?
Patriarch of Constantinople.
Yeah, but I don't know who's filling that office at the moment. It doesn't matter. Bartholomew, yes, that's right. But again, you never hear about him because orthodoxy is small compared to Catholicism in terms of adherents. I mean, the number of people on the eastern side right now is very, very small comparatively. Although there's a lot of Russians and Greeks and people from the Balkans that are all part of this church. But compared to Catholicism, which is covering the entirety of the West and all going into South America, and then much of the global South into Africa and into China and India is mostly Catholicism. So, Scriptures, very well promulgated at this point. Yeah. I don't think they needed to. At this point, by 300, the Scriptures are remember, the persecuted church did an excellent job of getting the Scriptures out because persecution itself did that job. I mean, you wanted your friends down the road to have a copy of it because, all of us persecuted Christians need to make sure that somebody else has a copy in case they come and steal and burn mine. So the persecuted church did an excellent job of moving the Scriptures around. Now, how much of the Scriptures are available in the common tongue of the people is small, undoubtedly, although, as you know, the New Testament is written in Greek, which is the common language even at this point. The Roman Empire speaks Latin, but everybody in commerce speaks Greek, even to the 4th century. So I don't think that there's an issue with people not knowing what the Scriptures say. The problem is interpreting the Scriptures through time. What to do with what Paul said about this or that, or even the example I gave, right, about Jesus coming to his baptism, and so people are looking at it, they go, wow, I interpret that as that's when God appointed Christ to be to be his spokesman on the earth, sort of thing. So at this very early time in the history of the church is wrestling with some of the most fundamental theological issues. Once you get past the point where the church is running for her life, just trying to survive, now it breaks out into the open with, whew, we can breathe. Okay, let's go back and sit down and read what it is that we have and figure out what it means. And that's really one of the most important parts of the Imperial Church, is that movement away from a persecuted church to a church now able to discuss theological things. And guess what happens when that happens? You get all kinds of heresy showing up. I think you do, yeah. Yes. Correct. It's coming. But in terms of the actual canon, it's already in place. There's no doubt at this point that James and Jude and Revelation belong in the New Testament at this point. There's no doubt of that. And there's no council, contrary to popular belief, or there's no belief in the church that Nicea simply established which books were canonical. There's no history of that in the minutes of the events at Nicea. Yes, there were men like Athanasius who brought along lists of which books belonged in order to clarify to people which books he considered to be scriptural. Because people are going to ask him, okay, which books are you appealing to for your position? So he says, well, I've got these 66, I've got these 39 that Jesus knew, and then I've got these other 27 which have been running around for the last 300 years. And so his list, many people look at it and say, well, see, that was an authoritative list of what the canon of Scripture was, so it was at Nicea where it was designed. No, Athanasius is simply saying, these are the books that I believe are Scripture, just like that guy over there does. We all believe these books. Okay, that's a good question. I think by this point, I could pretty much say with confidence, Scripture is saturating all of this discussion, even to its detriment. Many people can't read, but the elites could, the bishops could. So there's still a lot of folks who are able. Athanasius, as I said, was not, what we would call a seminary-trained bishop, but yet he's able to write, he's able to read, he's able to do logic. He's not an Augustine in terms of his intellectual capacity, but nonetheless, he's capable of writing and reading. On top of that, he's tenacious. That's right. And he's not going to give up on this. Yeah. Athanasius. Yeah. Athanasius the tenacious. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. I hope that's helpful to understand some things that might shed some light on even what we're going through in our day.